Hi everybody. So with this first tutorial, what I'd like to do is show you how to make one of these ambient space pad synths from scratch using pretty much any VST synth plugin or even a hardware synth. So something that sounds a little bit like this. So this is your classic space pad or planetarium music pad, or I like to call it the Brian Eno pad because it sounds like a lot of old Brian Eno or Steve Roach, that modular synth pad. Good for planetarium music, good for space music, good for meditation. Just very subtle changes, kind of flows like water. And if you're starting off, in, you know, and you're new to designing ambient pads or ambient sounds, this is really one of the places you want to start because most of ambient music is going to, the pad is really going to be the bread and butter of your overall sound. And this is a really good way to start learning how to build these pads from scratch so you're not just relying on, samples or presets, things like that. And you can really learn how to control and sculpt the sound that you really want. And the other good thing is it's pretty easy to build these. I mean, really, all you need some sort of VST synth that has multiple oscillators. The more oscillators, the better. I've got two engines here, oscillator 1, 2, 3, and oscillator 1, 2, 3. So really 6 oscillators plus a couple of utility engines that we'll talk about. And then you just need a couple of LFOs. This one's got 3 LFOs. I mainly just use 2, but I, can sometimes use 3. And then, of course, you're going to need some sort of effects. Most VSTs are going to have, your standard reverbs and delays in them. Or if you'd rather just use a plug-in reverb, plug-in delay effects, you're certainly welcome to do that as well. Okay, so I use Arturia's Pigments, which I think is just a great synth. It does pretty much anything you want a synth to do. It has different types of sound generators. It's got analog oscillators, wavetables. You can do samples and granular synth, and then it's got what it calls a harmonic engine. But we're really just going to focus on the analog oscillators because that's what most VSTs and outboard synths are going to have. But feel free to use wavetable too if you want. And I'm going to turn off the reverb that I have here. I'm going to turn off the EQ I set. And really the only thing other things I'm using here is just a leveler. This is a UAD sort of compressor leveler just to make sure you can hear the sound. And then a limiter here just so in case things get crazy, I don't blow out anybody's speakers. But that's really it. Nothing too fancy yet, but we're going to build it from scratch. So the first thing we want to do is I'm going to go to the default setting here in Pigments. If you have Pigments, it's under Template, and then just go to Default, and that's going to reset everything. If you're using a different VST or outboard synth, there's probably some sort of initial patch or default patch, but you just want everything to just reset basically to 0. And it's just going to give you a simple sine wave or maybe a sawtooth wave. Okay. So we're going to start off with that. And actually I'm going to start with analog here. Switch everything to sine wave. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so nice, simple sine wave. Nothing too fancy. Okay, and the magic is, it's really all you have to do is set your oscillators, and we're going to talk about that. Do a little bit of sculpting with your filter. Do a lot of modulation with your LFOs, and we'll talk about, what to set your LFOs to. Excuse me. And then we're going to add some effects because, quite frankly, most of ambient music and most of the pads, it's really the effects that drive everything. The oscillators and the synth, the impulse into the effects are really just there to send a signal or send an impulse into the effects and really let the effects do a lot of the work. Okay, but the first thing we're going to do is set our oscillators and then also set our LFOs here. So I'm going to go down to the LFO tab. And so whatever synth you're working in, if you've got a couple of LFOs, let's get those things set up first. What we want to do is take the rate way down and set it to hertz instead of synced to a beat. So, because the hertz is going to give you pretty much the slowest rate you can get. The other thing you're going to want to do is try to randomize it. And in Pigments, it's this little doohickey here, this little sign here for randomization. But I don't want it to be randomized on a square wave where it's just going to sort of pop up and down. So here I'm going to smooth that out. And so it's just going to sort of gradually go up and down, sort of like on a random sine wave. And then the other important thing is in Pigments, you want to set your LFO to free running, because if it's set to something else, then the LFO is going to restart every time you hit a key. However, if you have it at free running, it's just going to keep going at whatever level it's at. And for this type of synth, that's really the way you want your LFO going. You don't want it to restart every time you hit a key, because it'll just sort of jerk you out of whatever modulation it was doing. And again, we want to keep everything nice and subtle here. So I'm going to set this one to smooth, random. And one little trick I like to do, because again, we want everything to be very subtle. And so we don't want things being controlled by LFO2 to move at the same rate as LFO3, right? We don't want them to be lockstep with each other. So I'm going to take LFO3. I'm going to assign it to the rate just a little bit, just a tad, the rate of 2. And then I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to assign LFO2 to the rate of 3. So this way they're sort of controlling each other and moving each other up and down. And that should avoid them moving in lockstep. I guess the other thing is that these are set to bipolar, so they're going to go up and down. So it's going to go above your setting and then below your initial setting. You could do unipolar, that's fine too. Whatever you're comfortable with. Okay, so let's go back up to the oscillators here. So we've got our LFO set. And so what we want to do with our oscillators is we're going to take this one. So this is what I consider my second oscillator, and I'm going to move it up a whole octave. So that's 12 semitones. Okay, so my first oscillator, which is in engine 1, is just set to the normal regular tone, 0 semitones, regular tuning. my second oscillator, I moved up an octave. Okay, so you can I'm not entirely sure if you can hear that or not, but so you've got two sine waves playing an octave away from each other. Okay, and then for my other oscillator, so if you have three oscillators, this is another nice trick to do. It gives you some more tonality to it. Is you're going to take your third oscillator, again, assuming you've got one available, and you're going to move it up an octave, and then you're going to move it up another 7 semitones. So that's 5 whole steps. So it's going to be 19 semitones. You want to move that up 19 semitones. And so what that does is it moves it up an octave and then plus a fifth. So if you play a C, you're going to hear a G come in. That's a little, because they're kind of in the same harmonics, you don't really hear it that much, but it's a nice little subtle tone on top of it. Okay? Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to create some modulation on this so that we're not just stuck with one sound just sitting there buzzing in our ear. So I'm going to assign the LFO3, which again is moving sort of slowly, randomly up and down, to the volume of this oscillator that I set an octave up, 12 semitones up. And let's take the other LFO. And we don't want this to be as loud, but we're gonna have this set where this is also gonna go up and down in volume. So let's listen to this. Now, if you're listening on a phone or a laptop computer, speakers or something, you might not be hearing it, but it's there. It's subtly going, the higher pitches are subtly going in and out in volume. And it's just sort of creating that chorusy effect. It's very subtle, and it really shouldn't be drawing your attention too much. Okay, just sort of going in and out. Now, some of you might have a synth where there's sort of a mix knob going between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. You can use that too, but basically what you're doing is you're just going between oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 and hearing them sort of come in and out. And I'm going to move oscillator 1 up and down just a little bit. This is the low one because it's set to the original tone. And I don't really want it to move too much as the high ones, but we'll let it move a little just to get more of an effect. So you can really hear the effect now. Now the other thing, if you're sort of new to this and new to setting LFOs and stuff like that, one reason I like to use two different LFOs is I like to mix them together. So if I assign modulation to, let's say, the volume here, I want to do it with both LFO3 and LFO2. Once you've started modulating a lot of different parameters, you want to start mixing LFO3 and LFO2. And that way, if you have one parameter, let's say like the volume on oscillator 1 set to LFO3, and you had the volume on oscillator 2 set to LFO3, you don't want them moving together, right? Because anything that moves together, the brain is going to catch up on. And then it's going to start paying attention to that and expecting it. And you want to avoid that as much as possible when you're creating a pad. You want everything to be very, very subtle. You want things to move just like water without drawing attention to itself, right? Because as soon as the listener starts locking into something, then you lose that subtlety, you lose that sort of meditative effect. And then they're just sort of listening to, sort of a predictable movement. So if you sort of put a little bit of LFO3 and a little bit of LFO2 on everything that you're modulating, then they're not going to move in lockstep together. And of course, you can switch it so it's either going negative or it's going positive. Just kind of play around with your LFOs. But the trick is, number one, you don't want too much movement. And number two, you don't want different parameters moving together. So let's see here. So nice, subtle, little chorusy effect. Okay. So with our, so this is really it for our oscillators. We're going to add in a sub oscillator here. And again, this kind of assumes that you've got oscillators to work with. If you've got yet another oscillator, like Pigments does, you could set a sub oscillator. Now, some synths will also have a sub oscillator that you can use, so feel free to use that. Now, sub oscillators are usually set to either square waves or triangle waves. If you're using sine waves as your main oscillators, you want to try to set this to a triangle wave because the square wave is going to be a little too buzzy for us. So let's add in this. Now, you might not be able to hear it again if you're on phone speakers or laptop, but it's there sort of in the background. Now, if you wanted to, you could move this down 2 octaves. I had it 1 octave down. But that's getting to be a little much on the low end, so I'm going to bring that back up. Okay. All right. And let's add that to our other engine. Okay, we can mess with the width here. Get a little bit of pulsating effect. Be a little loud, but it's also getting a little buzzy. I'm going to avoid anything that's too buzzy, at least for this type of synth. Okay. Okay. Now, let's add some movement on the volume here. Mess around a little with the width. Okay, so our oscillator should be good. Now, with the high end, another thing I like to do is add a little bit of noise. Not too much, because again, we don't want it too buzzy. But what this is going to do is add a little bit of character to the high end. But we don't want it too much. We want it very, very subtle. So let's see here. Let's see how it sounds. Yeah, so you could barely hear it if you can hear it at all. The other thing that I'm doing over here is Pigments allows you to go from pink noise to white noise to blue noise, which is just sort of a different balancing of the random noise across the spectrum. But it's a really nice, subtle movement you can add. Okay, so there I'm getting a little bit too much on my high end, and that's because my first engine oscillator here is going down too low. I don't want it to go down that low. I just want it to move around just a little bit. Now the last thing, and those of you who are probably used to this are probably like begging me to set the amp envelope here. And yes, we definitely want to do that. So this is going to be your amplifier envelope or your VCA envelope. And you want a nice long attack, a long decay, and you want to bring your sustain down, right? You want it sort of sloping down like this, because if you leave your sustain up, then as you play different notes on top of each other, they're just going to start piling up and get real muddy. So you want to give it some time to kind of die off, and then some time to build up. A nice long release. I'm going to go a little overboard here, but as you can see, it's sort of slowly going out with the release. Again, if you had your sustain up, they just start getting muddy and building on top of each other. This is just nice and smoother. Okay. So now we have our basic sound. It's starting to come together, right? You can kind of hear it. Just a nice, simple pad, kind of sounding like an organ. Okay. And now the other thing we want to do, let's just give it a little roundness, a little body through the filter. Now, for those people who are first starting out, they like to get filter crazy. Where, you sort of fall in love with these big, filter sweeps. Well, but with a pad like this, you don't want to draw the attention of the listener to anything in particular. So try to avoid big, sweeping filter sweeps. At least anything that sort of moves on an LFO that's sort of routine. If you want to put filter sweeps in, we all love them. I'd recommend putting it in, using some sort of filter plug-in effect and sending it as an auxiliary effect. So you can sort of use it sparingly, but it's not just like constantly happening and drawing the listener's attention. So here we go. So you can hear it's rounded out a little. I'll turn the filter off so you can hear the difference. Not too much because we're dealing with sine waves, but it rounds it out a little. And it's just slowly moving, not really going very far, doing a little bit of resonance, but you don't want that to get out of control either. Too much resonance is going to just peak. You can hear that buzzing. Don't want that. Let's round it out here. Okay, so that's a nice basic start to our pad. So let's move over to, I think we're ready for the effects now. So like I said at the beginning, really the effects are really what's going to drive the overall texture and sound here. And so we're just going to use your standard delay and reverb. I'm going to, let me find a nice, motorcycle outside or something. That's not me. That's a real ambient sound coming in from the outside. So let's set this as cathedral, nice big reverb. And again, I'm going to put a little bit of LFO on the dry wet so that the reverb is sort of coming in and out. A little bit of LFO on the dry wet on the delay. Again, we want to use both LFOs for the most part when we're doing some modulation. And some modulation on the feedback, so it's going to kind of increase the delay. Stereo spread, you got to be a little careful here. I like to keep the stereo spread down for pads like this. That I really only like the stereo spread when it's like, kind of an ARP kind of sound, like a really sharp, percussive kind of sound that you want bouncing around the speakers. But for a pad, you don't want too much of that. Now we're hearing it. Now it's really starting to sound like a space age pad because we're getting those effects in there. Again, just sort of modulate what we can. Let's get some low end out of there. As you can see, the feedback is modulating here on the delay. I don't really mess with the time because that will get a little herky-jerky. Maybe a little bit on the fine part of the timing, but not too much. Again, I like to take out some of the lows on the effects to avoid having it get too muddy. I'll bring it sort of in and out. Okay. We're going to come back to the effects in a minute here, but there's one more thing I want to sort of set with the oscillators now that we've added some texture through the effects, and that's some unison. So most of your synths out there are going to have some sort of unison effect where you can control the number of voices, and it gives it a nice chorusy kind of sound. So for both engines, I'm going to rev up the number of voices, put some slight modulation through the LFO. Again, that might be a little bit more than I usually do, but I just want to make sure you hear the effect. Now you're getting that nice chorusy effect, like not just chorus, but it actually sounds like a choir coming through. I mean, that really builds good texture to the pad, what you're looking for. And again, it's just simple oscillators, a little bit of filtering, adding some unison, adding some delay, adding some reverb, and a whole lot of LFO to keep things sort of subtly moving around. There you go. Now, chances are that's probably all you need for a starter space pad planetarium type sound. And of course, as we're building these, our brain sort of gets used to it and we start looking for new things. And so it's real easy to sort of fall into the trap of just trying to add more and more stuff to your pad. But I would say, once you've gotten to this part, once you've gotten your oscillator set and they're moving around nice and subtly, and you've got a nice round filter on it, and you have some effects that sound really good and real, adding a lot of space and depth, and then your little secret sauce of unison. That's probably, and then of course your amplitude envelope or envelope. That's really all you need for your pad, right? And so a lot of times the best thing to do is just shut down, build the pad, save it, shut down for 5 minutes, take a walk, read something, come back 5 minutes, 15 minutes later, and you're probably going to be pretty happy with what you built. You could do a little tweaking here and there, maybe tone down one of the LFOs or turn up the volume on one of the oscillators, just anything to get your balance the way you like it. But chances are you're pretty close to what you want, and you don't need to start adding a bunch of modulators or distortion or anything like that. But one thing you might want to consider is if you've got shimmer, either as a plugin, I could recommend, as a plugin, I'd recommend Valhalla Shimmer. It's great. But any sort of shimmer effect, if your VST has it, this of course is sort of a cheat code, special sauce for ambient pads. And I'm gonna play it without any modulation real quick, just so you can hear what the basic shimmer effect sounds like. Right? So you can hear that high end sort of coming in, bring it in and out. Now take it out. You hear that? So that's the shimmer. Now the thing with shimmer is it sounds beautiful. It sounds great for about a second or two. But then it can get a little grating if you just let it sit there. And so you really want to sort of work on modulating it. So I'm going to bring it in and out with the dry signal. The other thing that helps, especially with these kinds of pads where you're trying to keep things subtle, is the default is usually up an octave. Move it down to 7 semitones. Again, that's a fifth. And so it's not as harsh of an effect. See, it sounds a lot more subtle. Okay, I'm going to increase the size. So shimmer is great. You just have to use it relatively as subtle as possible because it's very easy to get out of hand. But it really is a good effect if you keep it under control. So I'm really just pressing white keys here, just going through the pad. Just up and down, playing different white keys. Nothing, no magic to it. So once you've added the shimmer effect again, you're probably going to be pretty happy with this effect. You can really hear it when you lift up the key. You hear that shimmer just sort of shimmering off in the background. Real nice, subtle sound. So this is probably, a good place to stop for, when you're first starting to build these pads. And like I said, it's very, very easy to just wanting to, keep dumping things on. And I'd advise against that, just sort of go with nice and subtle. However, if you do want to dump some more stuff on, Pigments has this really nice utility engine that I like a lot, especially for this type of ambient stuff. And what it is basically a noise and just sort of random sound effects that you can put in the background. And so, as you can see, there's just a menu of different types of sounds, like computer keyboards and group laughing, and just the digital sounds kind of sound like computers going haywire. I like the natural sounds. Let's keep things natural here. So we can go with some dense rain. Now, rain a lot of times just ends up sounding like wind, and this is no exception. But let's get this nice switch between high pass filter and low pass filter, and so you can get some dimension to the sound. This is going to come in and out. And then, of course, another thing you can do, again, you want to avoid big filter sweeps and things that are going to draw the attention. But I do like a nice, subtle band pass. Very, very subtle. In pigments, I use the SEM. I really like that filter. And you can switch it to band pass mode down here. Band pass mode, unlike your low pass filter, right, that sort of cuts off the high frequencies, band pass just sort of does this nice little slope here. And as you move up the resolution, it's going to sort of increase the peak of the slope. Again, you don't want too much. Take the volume down on this too, because I don't want this to be too much of an effect. Now, and you'll have to also, whatever your synth is, you'll have to figure out whether it runs the filters in serial or parallel. Pigments runs them in serial as a default, so I guess switch it to parallel. So everything's going to be running through filter 1 and filter 2 in parallel, as opposed to going through filter 1 and then into filter 2. And so because of that, I'm going to have to move the filter mix so that it sort of shares between. Okay. And then, of course, we want to modulate that. Oops. So things are sort of subtly moving around between the filters. Let's do that here. Okay. And then this band sweep is just going to sweep across the spectrum very slowly. And again, we're keeping the volume down. You probably can't hear too much on it. It's not really moving around too much yet, but that's okay. It's there, nice and subtle. There's some movement. Again, these LFOs are on random, so they're not really they're gonna sort of move up and down sharply sometimes. Okay, the other thing I like to do, because with these types of pads, let's look at the EQ here. Let me actually reset it so you can see what I'm talking about. So you'll see some of these sort of start peaking. Excuse me. Get a little out of hand. One way to tame that is to put some modulation on the overall volume. I like to set it to an LFO. Then you can also move the pan around. This actually does it on the filters. And so that way you don't have the sound just sort of building up in one space. It sort of moves around a little bit. And so you can avoid that sort of screeching in your ear, because it'll move around a little bit more. Now, it's not going to stop everything. You're going to have to do some EQing and clean it up a little, but it definitely helps. And I'm going to take out the low end here. Get rid of some of the muddiness. As you can see, this little guy right here, he's pretty active. And so I'm going to take him down a little at the EQ. Just to sort of even things out a little. Now, you don't want to go too crazy and start pegging each of these down, because then you'll get this comb filter effect, and you don't really want that. So here we go. Really nice sounding pad. The rain can probably be a little bit more subtle. Now, of course, if you're one of those people who likes to have the rain in the background, go for it. Certainly do that. Nobody's going to yell at you. Now, of course, you can add on other noises, but one thing I like to point out is, try to keep your noises consistent. And what I mean by that is, like, if you start off with a rain noise in the background, and then you decide, oh, I can add some birds as well, right? That sounds kind of cool, but keep in mind, usually when it rains, the birds are not out chirping, right? And so there's something probably in the listener's mind that's going to be like, yeah, this seems a little off, right? Now, so, try to keep your sounds consistent and sort of natural. Same thing for, like, if you added in like a crowd noise or something with rain, right? I mean, you don't really see a whole lot of crowds laughing in the middle of the rain, but maybe, that might be the thing you're going for. Keep in mind the effects are going to be on there. It actually sounds pretty cool. So, tells you what I know. It also sort of adds a little to the high end of the spectrum, which helps balance out the overall sound across the spectrum. Let's do some movement on the high pass. Now, of course, this is going to draw the attention of the listener if it's too much, right? And so trying to keep it as subtle as possible, but still there. And nothing that, it's just going to sort of slowly come in and out so that the listener doesn't get too fixated on it. And the last thing we could do is just add another sub-oscillator. This provides us another one. This one we're just going to use as a sine wave. Again, a little modulation with the LFO. Go up and down. Send it to both filters. This one we're going to move it around a lot. And then maybe the last thing I want to do here is just add a plug-in reverb to really just balance out the sound, smooth it out. And this is just the chroma verb in Logic using a reflective Hall. Added a lot of size, added a lot of density, brought down some of the lows so it doesn't get too muddy. Big decay. You got the fairies dancing, that's always fun. It's nice and tame, right? Nice and tame right in here. Right where you want it. Now, of course, these pads just naturally sort of live in the low mids. Right here, as you can see in the EQ. You could use one of these shelves to sort of bring up some of the highs, but you can do that in your mixing, your mastering. Of course, it's going to bring out the rain. Balance things out a little. So you might want to go back into here and get that rain down so it's not overpowering. Yeah, so we're getting a little bit more presence. You can use your mastering software or a leveler, compressor or something and try to get some presence in there. That's probably beyond the scope of this session. Obviously there's lots of other things you could be doing in here, but like I said, once you start tacking on too much stuff, it starts becoming something totally different. And of course, it's fine if that's what you're going for, but for our purposes, let's just stick with the nice, subtle planetarium effect. Now, of course, in a planetarium, you're probably not going to see a whole lot of rain unless you're watching something about Earth. So maybe you want to do a little bit more of a atmospheric drone. Or if you're out in space, you might be out on a spaceship, and let's see if we could find some spaceshipy kind of metallic kind of sound. Yeah. So there's a little bit more space station kind of sounding. Like you're out some sort of space station. Something metallic. I could do this one too. That's kind of cool. Metal flow is probably what we're looking for. So you get a little bit more of that industrial, spacey sound. Like you're on a spaceship and sounds are sort of bouncing off the metal interior. Okay. So yeah, so Pigments really gives you the chance to sort of really redefine the pad by adding these sounds in the background that give you just a totally different ambient feel. So let's go from, kind of a spacey, space age, like you're in some sort of space station kind of sound, ambient, And then we can completely switch that to a forest. And where are birds? Birds in the forest. It's a totally different feel, right? Depending on what you're going for. Same pad, just different background sounds. Now, of course, it's very washed out, right? Because it's going through all of these effects. And so because of that, you don't get as much of a natural sound, right? So you might want to maybe use a different instance of this and just run this without all the effects in a different track. But it does sound pretty cool with the effects as well. Just whatever you're going for. Whatever sounds good to you. So, okay. Well, I think this is probably a good stopping point. Like I said, if we start tacking on too much stuff, then it's just going to become a completely different type of sound. So I'd be interested in seeing what you guys all come up with. So if you watch this and you feel like you learned something and you want to start putting together your own ambient pad, I'd love to see what you come up with. So feel free to link a video or a link to your music page on Spotify, Bandcamp, SoundCloud, all that. Also, if you have any comments, any questions, if I went too fast or went too slow, let me know. But especially if I went too fast and there's anything you sort of missed, I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And then if you have any requests of other types of ambient type sounds and sound design, programming, that kind of thing, let me know. Be happy to talk about it, assuming I know what I'm talking about. Okay. Thanks again for joining or watching, and I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.